So one of the most frustrating things that can happen when you're trying to do research, and it's something you have to accept, despite there still being intrigued to the whole thing. You find something and you think there's something bigger there than what actually is, or at least you think it might be there. So you start digging in and researching, like, maybe I found something here. And then by the time you're done, you're still kind of dumbfounded and bewildered by what you found, but it's not that it's not what you initially went in thinking, but it's probably not the case. That happened to me when I decided to go and look up kind of a master list of all of the unsolved murders. Well, at least that are on record, which are mostly murders from the early 70s up till now, that the police have on file as cold cases. I went through that master list just looking for interesting stories, and I discovered something very interesting. But when all is said and done, I don't really know what it means. I don't know if there's a connection, but there could be. All right, so just let me lay out how I got to this point. So I'm going through this list of all of these unsolved cold cases, and the preponderance of them are, you could say, younger people. And when I say younger, I mean people primarily under the age of 50. That makes up the majority. There's not anywhere near as many cases involving elderly people as there are, people still in the first 20, 30, 40, 50 years of life. So with it not being super common to discover a murder victim, cold case unsolved murder victim, over the age of 60 in this, just mess of people, it's even less likely that you will stumble onto a succession of murders unsolved regarding older people, and not just older people, specifically older women. I mean, when I went through this list, the number of people that I found over the age of 59, which the youngest victim I'm going to discuss in this video was 59, the oldest being 86. Victims over the age of 59, again, in a list that had probably a couple hundred people, I only found probably about 12 to 15 that involved anybody over the age of 59. And that's spanning from the early 70s to now, like almost a 50-year span. Only about 15 people over the age of 59, men and women. But as I was doing this, I discovered 8 cases of just women between the ages of 59 and 86, all older women, that were all murdered, all of them unsolved. And they occurred between March 12th, 1976 and September 12th, 1982, a span of about 6.5 years. 8 different older women were murdered, and nobody knows who's responsible for any of them. So when I first noticed that, I noticed this succession of women, all older, and there were other commonalities between a lot of them. A lot of them lived alone, a lot of them lived in apartments, and but some of them were just introverted, just on their own, living out their final years. Some of them had people that were caring for them or keeping an eye on them. And so there were some commonalities. But my first thought going into this was, what if these women were all killed by the same person and we just don't know? There's actually a lot of serial killers out there that have targeted older women. The most famous serial killers that we talk about, your Gacy's, your Bundys, a lot of them target younger people. But there's plenty of serial killers that have targeted older women. One of the reasons is if you're younger and they're elderly, odds are you're going to be able to overpower them in any set of circumstances. Earl Leonard Nelson, who's a guy that's believed to have killed at least 4 women in the Portland area during the late 20s and probably believed to have killed at least 30 women. He killed a lot of elderly women. It happens. Some serial killers target older people. So I went in. That was what really sucked me in. And I'll admit that. It wasn't just look at these cases and see if anything stands out. These people deserve justice. They were murdered horribly. Their cases have never been solved. They haven't gotten the justice they deserve. But at the same time, I'm willing to admit that what really pulled me into looking at these cases was I thought maybe this is a serial killer at work. And is there a great correlation between all these cases? And honestly, after looking all of them, the answer to that question is really neither yes or no. Because again, there's some correlations between a lot of the cases, but there's some instances that are completely different. And they're victims that were killed in an assortment of different ways. And while they were all killed in Portland, they were killed all over the place. So when all is said and done, I don't know what we have here. I don't know if we have a serial killer who traversed the whole city, which plenty kill all over one town. It would have to be a serial killer who altered their methods, which has been done, but it's not really common for them to change their habits so abruptly. Could it possibly be maybe 2 arguably serial killers that were focusing on older women? Maybe that's it. Maybe we just have a succession of women that were deemed victims of opportunity because they were older. Again, we're going the late 70s into the early 80s, and admittedly, a lot of these cases happened in the northern part of the city, and there was a lot more crime going on in that part of town. So, for all we know, when all is said and done, these cases may have absolutely nothing to do with each other. But for the sake of discussion and maybe to put the ball into your court a little bit and let you hear about them, I'm sure you'll see the similarities and of course the differences as well. I just want to go through these cases one by one, because no matter what the reality is of all of these murders, I find it so interesting that this just string of elderly women in Portland were killed during such a short succession of time. Now, the first victim in this mix was a 70-year-old woman named Jean Hooper, who was found dead a little after 11 p.m. March 12, 1976. And she lived on the 200 block of Northeast Sacramento Street. She lived just west of MLK, which would have been Union Avenue at the time. She was reportedly known to be an alcoholic who had a lot of frequent visitors to her apartment there. So is it possible that somebody that paid her a visit during one of those times may have been responsible? That's absolutely could have been the case in this matter. She was also known to leave her doors and windows unlocked, which again, this is the 1970s, and even though it's the era of serial killers blowing up, crime skyrocketing, it's a time period where a lot of people left their doors unlocked. That's just how it was back then. But Hooper was discovered, again, it's kind of interesting. It was a little after 11 p.m. and she was discovered by a cleaning lady who I assume was there to clean her place. Maybe this is somebody she hired independently. Maybe she was somebody working for the apartment as a whole. I don't know. It's just interesting to have a cleaning person coming in at 11 p.m. Wouldn't you think someone might be asleep at that time? So I don't know why the discovery happened at that time, why the cleaning woman was there, but the cleaning woman had the unfortunate luck, if you can call it that, of discovering Hooper. She was dead. She had been beaten and strangled, strangulation being the cause of death in her case. And I want to make a point right now, as you'll see throughout the story, that's pretty much all the information I found on Gene Hooper. Most of these murders, there is little to no information out there. I mean, some of these cases I looked up on the newspaper databases I use, nothing, not one single article about someone who was murdered in their home. Only a handful of them did I find any like actual newspaper articles for, and very rarely did they offer me any more information than the primary source I went to for this, which most of the information I got for the story comes from the the master kind of cold case list for all these cold cases in Portland, which if you click on each name, they give you a paragraph or two of information, and oftentimes that information isn't a lot. So all of these murder cases, there's very minimal information available. So what I just told you about Gene Hooper is really all there is known on the case. And as you will see as I discuss each successive woman, most of them, there's really not a whole lot. But Gene Hooper was the first of these 8 to turn up dead, and she was killed by strangulation while also being beaten as well. So the next victim in this list is killed less than 2 months later on May 2nd, 1976. 77-year-old Grace Elliott is discovered dead in her home on, all listed was 67th Avenue, so I don't know if it was northeast 67th Avenue or southeast. My gut tells me it was northeast 67th. It was the 2700 block, but there's a 2700 block for both northeast and southeast, so it's really hard to say for absolute certain. But Grace Elliott was kind of the opposite of Gene Hooper, who again left her doors unlocked, had a lot of people visiting. They said she was an alcoholic. She obviously, even as she was getting older, she still liked to have fun in her life. In the case of Grace Elliott, she was a little bit more of a recluse. She was a widow. I don't know how much the passing of her husband had an effect on her that may have led her to being sort of the recluse she had become. And she was discovered by a neighbor when a welfare check was requested on her behalf. And here's the frustrating thing is when Grace Elliott was found, the only information that's given is that she died of homicidal violence. And that's another frustrating thing in this dynamic, 'cause I don't think this is the only instance in these 8 cases where the actual cause of death isn't given. It's just known it was a murder that took place, because they'll say it was a homicide or somebody died of homicidal violence. Well, what does that mean? Were they beaten? Were they strangled? Were they shot? So, it kind of leaves things open. It makes it a little bit difficult to see if there's a connection between some of these cases or whether they're all completely different. And while she was discovered sometime on May 2nd, the last time she was heard from was the previous night. During the 9 o'clock hour, she had a phone call with her sister-in-law. So we know she was alive at least, from 9 to 9:30. The earliest she was killed was probably around 10 p.m., if not, and probably maybe more likely sometime in the middle of the night. Maybe someone broke in thinking nobody's going to be around, nobody's going to be listening, everyone's asleep. But it's very interesting. It's amazing how we notice little details, and sometimes we notice them without realizing that we notice them, but then they can end up benefiting us at some point. So Grace Elliott was known for always having her curtains cracked open a little bit. She always had them like that, just a little bit. Not wide open, but just a little bit. And the reason the welfare check was called for her was because neighbors noticed that her curtains were closed, and her curtains were never closed. So this was a rarity, even though it was a matter of a difference between this and this. Neighbors noticed, and they got concerned enough that they contacted somebody to go check on her. And that's when Grace Elliott is discovered dead. So we have 2 women in their 70s killed within 2 months of each other. Even if Grace Elliott lived on Northeast 67th, she still would have lived quite a distance away from Gene Hooper, a minimum of 3 to 3.5 miles apart, but still, they would have both been towards the north end of the city. But from there, we have to fast forward almost to the day, 3 years, 3 years and almost a week. It's May 8th, 1979, and 64-year-old Daisy Motley. It's a very similar situation. She was living on the 600 block of North Brazzy. I always get that street name wrong. I want to call it Brazy, but it's Brazzy. So I actually looked it up on Google Maps, and there's an apartment complex right there, and it looks not super old, but older, located at 7th and Brazzy, and that apartment complex, it says, was built in 1973, so that's likely the site that she was living in. And like Grace Elliott, attention is brought to the apartment where Daisy lives, and this is where I definitely think this case and the next case I'm going to discuss, there might be a connection, because the circumstances with which attention was drawn to these two murders is very comparable. And what happened in Daisy Motley's case is it's May 8th, and an anonymous call comes through to management saying they're hearing loud commotion and noises coming from Daisy's apartment that's maybe a cause for concern, and that someone should check on her. Again, somebody requesting a welfare check. But the implication is that if they're hearing this, they must be in the unit next to Daisy. But in the information, they make a point of saying that this was an anonymous call. So I wonder, was this perhaps the killer making a phone call afterward? I don't know why they would try to draw attention to the apartment quickly themselves, but I don't understand why a potential witness or a next door neighbor would want to be anonymous in a situation like this, unless they were more introverted than I am and just don't want to get involved in anything. But the manager took note and tried to contact Daisy's apartment by phone. She didn't answer, so the manager went to her unit, knocked on the door. There was no response. So by that time, the manager decided this may be a serious situation. I don't even know if they were, obviously the person who made the phone call said there was commotion going on in her apartment, but also for all we know, she could have had an accident of some kind, and she could have knocked herself unconscious, and she may be in need of medical attention. And so the manager uses a pass key to gain access to her apartment and discovers Daisy Motley there dead. And this is another instance where it was mentioned that she had been sexually assaulted, which I don't know for certain if that happened in the previous two cases I discussed. But there was mention that she had been assaulted. But how she had been killed, again, was not mentioned. It just said that she'd obviously been murdered. She died as a result of a homicide. I know when someone gets sexually assaulted, usually, from what I've gathered, the most common method of killing that victim afterwards is strangulation. So conventional wisdom leads me to think that Daisy Motley was probably strangled to death. But again, the definitive information just hasn't been there. And like Grace Elliott, the last time Daisy Motley is heard from alive, it's during the 9 o'clock hour of the previous night, when she had been on the phone with her daughter. And like the previous two victims, and as was kind of a constant in all these cases, Daisy lived alone. And it also said in the information I found that authorities felt in this regard that Daisy likely knew her attacker. I don't know if that is to mean that they didn't find any signs of forcible entry, so whoever killed her, she may have allowed into her apartment, thinking she could trust them. That's the first thought that comes into my mind. And it was also expressed that robbery was not believed to be a motive in this case, and I noticed that that's another fairly consistent detail in these murders is that robbery was not a motive. And, most of these women were living in little apartments. Some of them lived in, homes, but a lot of them weren't necessarily destitute, but they weren't rich. They didn't have a massive coin collection. They didn't have a huge stockpile of jewelry they'd been collecting their whole lives. These were not the primary type of people you would go after if your objective was to come away with riches, so to speak. So it makes sense to me that it didn't seem like robbery was really ever a motive in any of these cases. But again, if robbery's not a motive, your next thought is, well, it's sexual assault. It's the thrill of that. It's the assault and the kill. Just some crazy person getting their rocks off doing something like that. But not all of these victims were sexually assaulted either. So what was the motive in their cases? And again, as I mentioned while talking about Daisy, I think there could, if there's no connections with the other ones, I feel like there's definitely a possible connection between Daisy's murder and the next one on this list, which was the murder of 82-year-old Myrtle H. Thomas, who was killed January 3rd, 1980. So several months down the road from when Daisy Motley was killed, but not too much further down the road. But like Daisy Motley, Myrtle Thomas is discovered dead in her apartment. Another woman who lived in an apartment. It was a duplex, but duplex is an apartment. And she was discovered by the individual who was her caregiver. Now, the reason the caregiver showed up on the scene this day was because, like in the case with Daisy Motley, they got a call from someone choosing to remain anonymous. And in the information I read, it only said that the call was described as being disturbing. What that means, why the call from an anonymous person saying you should check up on so-and-so would be disturbing, I don't know what the details are, but that suggests to me potentially someone who we may theorize was responsible. And again, if it's just a neighbor or someone passing by who realizes there's something awry here, or maybe they know Myrtle and they know who her caretaker is and they call and they want to let her know, why would somebody like that choose to be anonymous? It's almost the exact same thing. And it's important to mention this in relation to the city of Portland, which is so white. Both Daisy Motley and Myrtle Thomas were both African American women. So does that mean anything? Did it show that perhaps there was a racially motivated connection here? Because there's definitely little elements that suggest a possible correlation. And like Daisy Motley, Myrtle Thomas lived alone. She was also described as being kind of a recluse, kind of just trying to keep to herself. And there was no signs of forcible entry, and there was no signs of robbery. It was very comparable. And in Myrtle Thomas's case, it did say that she was killed by stab wounds. Someone had stabbed her to death. I don't know if that's what happened in Daisy Motley's case, because again, it doesn't say. But in Myrtle Thomas's case, we do know it was a stabbing. And she lived at 2743 North Kirby, which is now an open lot right next to the Emmanuel Hospital in North Portland, and a location that's actually not too far from where Daisy Motley lived. We're talking blocks, less than 20 blocks apart from each other. Now, something that has eluded the previous three cases I've discussed, but did show up in the Myrtle Thomas case, is at least a slight description of a possible suspect, because a neighbor noticed the night before Myrtle Thomas was found dead, that a white male with long blonde hair and a full beard was sitting on the steps right in front of her unit. Who was that guy? We have no idea. Is it somebody that knew her? Was it someone that she trusted? Someone that she allowed to come into her home and he then killed her? Was it a son, a grandson who came and visited her and just nobody knows about that because Myrtle will be the only one to know and she was killed shortly after? Who knows? But it seems very possible that that individual sitting on her front porch, described as a white man with long blonde hair, stands to reason he's a likely suspect in her case. Did he also kill Daisy Motley? We don't know. I just think there's more than enough there to suggest a possible connection between the two. But we're only halfway through these murders. And for the next case, once again, we have to move forward several months. It's September 25th, 1980. And 62-year-old Ann Cassio lives in Southeast Portland with her husband. She lived at 3233 Southeast 26th Avenue, located Southeast 26th and Franklin. And if there's any case that is the most disassociated with all the rest, I feel like this is the one. The details are very different. First of all, this is a woman who lived with somebody else. She lived with her husband. Some of the other victims here were widows, so they had previously lived with their husbands, but by the time of their deaths, their husbands were gone and they were living alone. But in this case, we have a woman who lived with her husband, and she also lived in Southeast Portland. All these other victims, presumably in one case, lived on the north end. And here we have Ann Cassio living on the southeast side. Now, it appears that Ann was likely downstairs in the basement of the home, probably either doing laundry or about to do laundry, because her husband had left to go to the store. When he came back, he noticed that it was very interesting. He saw no signs of forcible entry. He came home and everything seemed fine. But when he entered the home, there was signs that it had been burglarized. So again, we have robbery coming into the fray for the first time as well. And so her husband, Vincent, is obviously very concerned. He starts searching for his wife, or possibly a perpetrator who's still inside their house. And he gets downstairs and discovers his dead wife laying on the floor of the basement near their washer and dryer. She had died by blunt force trauma to the head. So we have a couple cases where we don't know the cause of death, but we have one strangulation, one stabbing, and in this case, one death by blunt force trauma. Again, if there is a connection between all of these other cases, if there was one case I would say isn't related, if I had to choose one in all of these, it would be this case because of these various details. So either she was downstairs and attacked there and left there by someone who then ransacked the home looking for things, or she was attacked upstairs and relocated to the basement. I feel like that's the less likely scenario. It forces our killer to do more stuff when he just wants to steal some stuff and get lost. It seems to me like probably somebody who was watching the home. Otherwise, it's pretty coincidental that he shows up right after Ann's husband leaves and is able to attack her in the home by herself. So again, while she was living with her husband, she wasn't living alone. She was at home alone when she was attacked, but that's real. That and the fact that Ann was an older woman, those are really where the connections to the other cases cease for the most part. And from a case that, again, I feel is least likely connected with the others, we come to the case where there's honestly the least amount of information available. It's really kind of bizarre how little information is available and how many questions are left floating in the air about what happened in this instance. But it is an unsolved murder case. And we move forward again several months. It's March 14th, 1981. 82-year-old Rose Warsnop, hoping I'm pronouncing her name right. She lived at the southeast corner of Albina Avenue and Deacon Street. And literally, like, here's all the information I got on Ancasio. Here's Rose Warsnop's information. There's nothing there. All I found was at 4:55 p.m., police arrived at the home there after reports of a deceased woman being there, which was discovered to be Rose Warsnop. She was found to have died again, homicidal violence. What does that mean exactly? We don't know, but they did not give the cause of death. But I couldn't even find details about what led to the police being called to the scene there, who called them, who found her dead. Was she found dead in her home? Because all it's really said is that a dead woman was found in a home. I would figure it's probably her home, but even that detail, we don't know for absolute certainty. But whatever the circumstances, we have another woman more towards the north end of Portland. She's in her early 80s, and she turns up dead due to homicidal violence. We now have to move forward more than another year. It's July 10th, 1982, and Lena Malmberg, who at 86 years old is the oldest victim in the discussion here, she was living in the 2900 block of Southeast 20th Avenue, and she actually lived only 6 blocks away from where Ancasio lived, which I find very interesting. Whether there's a connection between the two or not, the fact that they lived so close to each other, both turned up dead mysteriously, is cause for intrigue. But it's another one of these stories where a concerned party, in this case her daughter, was not able to get in touch with her for a while, so she became concerned. And, you call your mom, she's not answering, so she went out to her home and immediately noted that there was damage that had occurred on her door. So it seemed abundantly clear that somebody had tried to break in. Now, again, this is a little bit of a deviation from most of the cases in this situation, because a break-in usually implies a robbery is going to follow for one, but beyond that, it also goes in contravention to a lot of the cases I've discussed where there was no signs of forcible entry. It seems like whoever got inside that house, either Lena didn't know was trying to get in, or was somebody she probably didn't want to get in. And there was also a broken window. Like, whoever was trying to get in was going to see to it that they got into her home. And from the information I found, it seemed like they couldn't really determine if anything had been stolen, but it did appear that somebody had kind of gone through some of her belongings, so at least a robbery was possible, at the very least an afterthought that they engaged in. But before getting to that, seeing the damage to the home, Lena's daughter quickly called the police. She doesn't know if whoever's responsible for this is still inside the house. She could be walking into a gun or something like that for all she knows. So the police show up on the scene and they go into the house and they discover Lena, who again, at 86, she also had mobility issues, often had to use a walker. Anybody who attacked her, she probably wouldn't have had a chance fighting back against. She was discovered in her bedroom, dead, and it was deemed that she had died of traumatic asphyxiation, which when I read that, I had no clue what that meant. A general description I found online, which I think kind of explains it for me, but I'm not going to act like I know. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a medical professional, but this one description simply says, traumatic asphyxia is a type of mechanical asphyxia where respiration is prevented by external pressure on the body, at the same time inhibiting respiratory movements and compromising venous return to the head. And there's reference to the causes. Traumatic asphyxia occurs when a powerful compressive force is applied to the thoracic cavity, which is here. So it seems to me like whoever killed her put a lot of pressure on her chest area. So much pressure that it prevented her from being able to breathe, which is just a horrible way to die. I don't know why. You know, if you felt you had to kill the old woman that's living in the house for whatever reason, that's one thing. But, man, what a way to do it. Anyway, that was how Lena Malmberg's life ended. In just a horrible, frightening, painful way. And another case that to this day is left unsolved. And that brings us to the last case of these 8. And that moves us forward just a couple of months to September 12th, 1982. And we go from the oldest victim in this case, or of these cases, to the youngest. Lillian Halpin, who was 59 years old. And she was living on the 9400 block of North St. Louis Avenue, which she was living in St. John's. So another case that happened on the north side of Portland. So we have, I believe, 6 of these cases, presumably happening on the north side of Portland. And the 2 cases that happen on the south side are in southeast Portland, and they happen only blocks from each other. But comparable to the other stories, Lillian Halpin is another case where she hadn't been heard from for actually several days. It's believed the last time anybody heard from her was sometime between September 5th and September 8th. So anywhere from 4 to 7 days before the 12th was the last time anybody had seen her. And see, she also lived in an apartment complex, but in this case, she was the manager of the apartment complex as well. So there was not necessarily more cause for concern, but more people were coming out as concerned, because when you manage apartment complex and then you go missing, you know, whatever anybody's going to need for help, maintenance, whatever on a given day, they're all going to come to you and wonder why you're not there. And then they come back the next day and you're not there. And all of a sudden, the manager of our the manager of our apartment complex has been gone for like almost a week. What is going on? So finally, after the stress and concern of her being missing for so long, somebody finally went to her actual unit that she lived in the apartment complex, and she was discovered dead. She had been strangled to death, just like Jean Hooper. Those are the only 2 cases out of the 8 where it's definitively said strangulation was the cause of death. Lena Malmberg dying by traumatic asphyxia is, I mean, not too much different. It's kind of a strangulation through the chest instead of through the throat. And, you know, it is interesting because Lillian Halpin, she lived way up on the north end of St. John's, kind of near Pure Park, which is a big park up there. I've explored through there before, but it's an area that's always been kind of known for having a lot of crime. I remember when I did a vlog video there a few years ago, one of the first things I talked about was the number of shootings and or murders that had happened just in the blocks surrounding the park over the past couple years. There's always been violence in that area. So is it possible that Lillian Halpin just fell victim to that reoccurring violence in her area? That's possible. We can't say for certain. But she appears to be the last one in this mix. I didn't find another older woman killed for, I think, at least a few years on down the line. There was an older couple. Their last name escapes me, but they were both brutally murdered in 1988, and it's kind of one of Portland's more infamous unsolved murders of recent memory, and they were an older couple as well. But after Lillian Halpin's murder in September of 82, there was, a period of years between that murder and the next murder of an older woman. But then you have these 8 murders that happen over the course of only 6.5 years, and all of them go unsolved. And again, you can see the differences in these cases. Unfortunately, a few of them, we don't know exactly how the victims died. So we don't know necessarily whether one may be tied to another. But we have a few different methods of murder. We have strangulation, we have traumatic asphyxiation, we have blunt force trauma, we have a stabbing. So we have a plethora of different types of killings. But most of these victims lived on their own. 6 of the 8, as far as we can gather, there was no signs that robbery was a motive. Only in one instance did I read that victim was sexually assaulted. So I obviously can't say for absolute certain that none of these victims were sexually assaulted, but that certainly wasn't in any of the information that I found. And I feel like that's a pretty significant detail in terms of trying to understand who the perpetrator might have been. So it seems like in most of these cases, assault, that form of violence, was not the driving force. So what was the driving force behind attacking a lot of these women? Because a lot of times it's robbery, sex, or you're just a psycho killer. A lot of the time. So for a lot of these victims, what was the motive for their killing? Was Daisy Motley and Myrtle Thomas, were their cases connected in terms of how closely they correlated with each other, and the fact that they were both African American women? There's a lot of correlations here, but there's also a lot of differences. I find it very hard, when all is said and done, to entertain the notion that these women were all killed by the same person, or even that necessarily a preponderance of them were killed by the same person. But I definitely think there's instances where 2 of them may have fallen victim to the same killer, maybe even more than that. The truth is, without more information, it's really hard to say, and I'm certainly not trying to reach any solid conclusions tonight, but it seems like there's not really going to be a lot more information coming out about these cases in the near future, so there's no point in putting something like this on the back burner. If I'm going to cover these stories, I'm going to cover these stories now, because 10, 20 years from now, unless one of these cases gets solved, odds are we're not going to know any more then than we do right now. I just stumbled onto something that was bewildering to me, that perplexed me, that I really thought there could be a definite tie between all of these, because why are so many, specifically older women, dying in this short period of time? In the end, again, I come away feeling like some of these cases were probably, could have been robberies gone wrong. But yeah, there's some instances where there could be a correlation between the cases, considering the fact that there wasn't a robbery involved, or that there wasn't sexual assault involved, or that a lot of these cases happened on the north end of town, and lots of these victims lived only a succession of blocks apart from one another. I don't have a massive conclusion to reach about all of this. I'm still left, reflecting and wondering what this all means, and where the real connections are between these cases, and what is potentially deceptive, what is kind of set dressing, what makes me want to think there's a connection when really there probably isn't. It's just a very interesting string of events that, again, more than anything, I mean, I wanted to bring these cases to light on my channel because, again, a lot of them, there's not a lot of information available, and they're not cases that a lot of people are talking about, but these are still, you know, women who were brutally killed, who had people out there who loved them. And the fact that they're older women, they not only had children that loved them, but some of them may have had grandchildren that loved them. So I wanted to bring these cases to light because I feel like they deserve at least that much. But also, I wanted to throw them out there to see what you all think about this. What cases that I've discussed do you maybe think there could be a connection on? And are there things that I expressed I think make possible connections that you maybe don't see it the same way? I definitely feel that this is a video that opens up room for discussion and reflection more than me trying to find a solution to something when I really don't have enough evidence to be doing that. It's kind of irresponsible, more or less. So that's really why I want to discuss these cases and put them out there. It's just a very intriguing succession of crimes to me. That did happen at a time where crime, particularly violent crime, was on the rise everywhere. Portland was no exception. So who's to say what the truth really is in all these cases? I really don't know. But in that same vein, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you all have some thoughts about the cases. And I mean, if you look up Portland cold cases, you can find all 8 of these listed and with the names. They put them in alphabetical order based on their first name. So if their name starts with an A, they'll be near the top of the list. So you can find them that way. And again, there's not a lot of information available, but it's general information is out there to be seen. So all that said, I'd like to thank you all so much for stopping by. I appreciate your support. If you want to give the video a like, help it in that way. I really appreciate it. If you like what I'm doing, you support what I'm doing. You haven't gotten around to it, or you're new to the channel or anything like that, please subscribe to the channel. I'm really looking to keep it growing. And I also have a Patreon if you want to help me out that way. I really appreciate it. I'm trying to get that to grow as well and to make doing what I do with papers all over the place. Trying to make it a little bit easier. The link to my Patreon is in the description with this video, as well as the links to my Facebook, Instagram, Reddit subreddit, and my TikTok. So all that said, thanks again for stopping by. Really appreciate it. Till next time, this has been Steve the Amateur Historian.